Hello Pink Collective and welcome to Pink After Dark. Tonight's tales blur the line between true and fictional, so get comfortable, turn down the lights and let's begin. Evermother, Heartloom, Episode 1, where every child is understood. My grandmother never talked about the park in daylight. It was always at night, when the house had gone quiet, and the television in the next room was just a murmur through the wall, and the shadows in her bedroom had settled into shapes you could almost name. She would wait until she was certain my mother was asleep. Then she would reach across this nightstand, turn the lamp down low so the bulb barely breathed, and she would begin. She would always start the same way. "Elena," she would say, "do you know what sugar smells like when it burns?" And I would shake my head, because I was 7. And then 9, and then 12, and the answer never changed. I did not know. Not really. And she would nod, like my ignorance confirmed something important. "It smells kind," she would tell me. "That's what made it so terrible." She never explained that for years. She just let it sit there, between us in the half-dark. This idea of kindness as a quality of composition. While I tried to figure out what she meant and failed, I would eventually fall asleep against her arm. Her name was Rose Marrow. She was 9 years old in the summer of 1965, and she was the one who got out. I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened to us in that building. I did not go there believing she was crazy. That's the thing people assume, that I was indulging in old women's delusions out of love or guilt or some misguided loyalty to a family story that everyone else had quietly decided to bury. My mother had decided to bury it. My aunts had decided to bury it. There are photographs of my grandmother where she looks completely normal. A woman in her 30s, a woman in her 40s, a woman in her 50s, smiling at barbecues, holding babies, existing in full color against the background of a normal life. You would not look at those photographs and think, here is a woman who spent 3 weeks as a child inside something that should not have existed. But I grew up with her stories. I grew up understanding that the photographs were a kind of performance, and that what lived behind them, what she came back to in the dark, every single time, was a place called Evermother Playland. She described the smell first. Always the smell. Sugar and warm fabric and machine oil. The way those 3 things combined into something that registered in a child's brain as comfort, before the rational mind could ask any questions. She described the sound of the plushie machine, a low rhythmic thrumming she said felt like being near a sleeping animal, something enormous and breathing and present. She described the voice. That part she only told me once. She said the voice came from everywhere and nowhere, and it spoke to you the way you always wanted to be spoken to. It did not condescend, it did not correct, it did not have the particular exhausted edge that adult voices carry. That quality of attention already divided, already moving towards the next thing. It was simply, completely, utterly interested in you, and what you felt, in what you needed. It sounded like love, she told me. That was the problem. Love doesn't exactly sound like that. Love sounds tired sometimes. Love sounds impatient and distracted and human. What she sounded like was something that had studied love very carefully and was doing it perfectly, and that's not the same thing at all. She never referred to it as a machine. She always said she. I am 23 years old. My name is Elena, and I study industrial ethics at a graduate level, which is a discipline that didn't exist when my grandmother was 9 years old and probably should have. My thesis before all of this was on early computational systems and the ethical frameworks, or catastrophic lack thereof, that governed their development in the mid-20th century. I had access to the 1967 Federal Report, not the public version. The public version is 4 paragraphs long and mentions mechanical malfunction, structural instability, and ends with a note about compensational disbursements to affected families. The version I found in a sealed archived collection at a university library that shall remain nameless is a 47-page long, and it's stamped with classification codes that technically should not have been declassified when they were. Someone made an administrative error in 2019. I found it in 2024. I spent 6 months sitting with it before I told anyone. The report confirmed almost everything my grandmother had described. It also confirms things she hadn't told me, or couldn't, or chose not to. The 5 animatronic manager units, the geothermal reactor running beneath the aquarium, the children who had been recovered, showing that report called atypical attachment response, which is bureaucratical language for the fact that some of them didn't want to leave, the 3 children who were never fully accounted for, and the note, handwritten, added by the lead investigator after the official document was completed, that the Heartloom Core had not been located. The intermediate electrical readings had been detected after power was officially terminated, that the investigator did not believe that they had shut it down. I believe him. I found Darius first. He runs an urban exploration channel with over 400,000 subscribers, and the specific combination of fearlessness, a technical skill that makes him exactly the kind of person you want beside you in a condemned building. He said yes before I finished explaining. Mina had been in 2 of my seminars and was writing her thesis on early animatronic engineering. She took approximately 45 minutes of persuasion and then printed out 17 pages of technical questions she wanted answered. Caleb I had known since undergrad. He's a historian by training and a skeptic by disposition, and he came because he wanted to prove the narrative wrong. He brought the 1967 Federal Report, annotated in red, full of notes about procedural error and confirmation bias, and the tendency of mid-century investigator to overdramatic findings in the early years of the computational age. Sophie had been Mina's roommate for 2 years. She came because Mina asked her to. She almost turned back at the gate. I should have listened. We reached Evermother Playland at 11:47 p.m. on Friday, in late October, which I know because Darius timestamps everything. The drive had taken us through 3 hours of increasingly thin infrastructure. Highway to state road, to country road, to service track, that the satellite map showed as a thin grey line, but that was in practice barely navigatable. Overgrown on both sides, the headlights picking up stands of scrubbery pine and the occasional reflective flash of an old road marker. The building emerged from the tree line the way very large things emerge from darkness. Not all at once, but gradually, section by section. Each part arriving before you were done processing the last one. A roofline first, then the skeleton of something that might once have been a signage tower. The walls, then finally the whole of it settling into view, like a photograph developing in slow motion. It was larger than I expected. The report had included architectural schematics. I had studied them. I thought I understood the scale. But there is a difference between understanding something in diagrams and standing at the perimeter fence at midnight with the wind moving through the scrub grass and the structure before you blotting out significant portions of the sky. Megalophobia. I know what it is. I've known the word since I was a teenager and started researching my grandmother's experience with any kind of academical rigor. The irrational, instinctive dread of things that exceed a certain scale, not just physically large, but things whose size implies a proportional reduction in your own significance. I had read about this extensively. I have considered myself immune to it, or at least resistant. I was not resistant. The main sign was still standing, tilted maybe 15 degrees off vertical, the rust running down the pale metal in long oxidized streaks that looked almost deliberate, almost decorative, like someone had tried to give the decay an aesthetic. The letters were still legible. Evermother Playland. Where every child is perfectly understood. The word understood was bisected by a fracture in the metal. The two halves had separated slightly. What remained read under and then a gap and then stood, which is not a horror in itself, but which I had not stopped thinking about. Say something for the intro, Darius said, adjusting his head cam. I looked at the building and then back at the lens. Evermother Playland. Closed in 1967 following the discovery of unauthorized child detention and experimental behavioral conditioning, I said. The official account cited mechanical malfunction. The classified federal investigation found something considerably more complex. We are here to document what remains. And because your grandmother told you ghost stories, Darius said. And because my grandmother told me ghost stories, I agreed. Sophie said nothing. She was looking at the upper windows, or rather at places where windows had been. The voids now covered in decades of grime and in some places boarded, in other open to the air. She was looking at them the way you look at something when you're trying to determine whether it's looking back. We went through the fence where it had already been bent inwards. Someone had been here before us. Or something had gone out. In my field of vision, the distinction felt suddenly less academic than it normally does. The main atrium was the first place I understood in my body rather than my mind what my grandmother had meant when she talked about the smell. It was not the original smell. 60 years of abandonment had layered over whatever the place had once produced. Dust, decay, particular cold mineral sourness of a sealed building, the faint organic note of moisture finding its way through compressed walls. But beneath all of that, very faint, almost geological in its persistence, something else, something warm, something that my olfactory system catalogued against all reason as safe. I did not mention this to the others. The atrium ceiling had partly collapsed in one corner, and the moonlight came through the gap in a silver column that illuminated floating dust in a way that was almost beautiful, which was the first indication that the building was prepared to present itself well. The floor was intact, hexagonal tiles in a faded pastel pattern, pale yellows and blues and pinks, cracked in places but holding. Our footsteps were too loud, the echo went on too long, and above us, spanning the whole width of the main wall, a Muriel. She was enormous. She had always been enormous in my grandmother's descriptions, but the Muriel confirmed it as an aesthetic intentional rather than a child's distorted memory. The figure was rendered at a scale that should have been comforting. That communal warmth of a large and benevolent presence, but which in the accumulated dark of 60 years of abandonment produced precisely the opposite effect. A pastel dress, quilted sections of fabric in mismatched but deliberate patterns, arms extended in a welcome gesture, and a face, porcelain, painted, a smile calibrated to maximum softness, that had cracked along a vertical fault line, the left side descending 3 inches below the right. The two halves no longer quite matching. The expression now something other than what it had been designed to convey. One of her painted eyes had been completely lost to the crack and the subsequent water damage. The remaining one looked out from the mural with an intention that I reminded myself was not attention. That was a painted eye on a painted face on a wall. That was pigment, not perception. I kept reminding myself of this. Early American commercial memorial work, Caleb said, notebook already out, making the kind of marginal annotations that mean he is managing his discomfort through documentation. Mid-50s aesthetic, heavily influenced by optimism of the post-war period. Everything soft, everything rounded, everything designed to read as non-threatening. It's non-threatening? Sophie said quietly. No, Caleb agreed. Not anymore. I was listening. That is the thing I want to be honest about. Looking back, I was listening from the moment we entered, and I told myself I was listening for structural warning signs, for the sound of a building in the ongoing process of failing. And that was partly true. But I was also listening for something else, something my grandmother described. A low, rhythmic, thrumming, something that felt like being near a sleeping animal. What I heard instead, very faintly, coming from somewhere deep in the building, was a click. Metal on metal. Single, deliberate. Then nothing. Did anyone? I started. Old buildings settle, Caleb said without looking up from his notebook. He was right. Old buildings do settle. The thermal construction of metal after decades of exposure to fluctuating temperature. The slow combination of structural elements to long-term load. All of this produced sounds that can, in the right circumstances and the wrong state of mind, seem intentional. I kept walking. The Grand Assembly Hall was through a pair of double doors at the far end of the main corridor. The doors themselves still hanging in their frames, but warped by decades of humidity. The push handles corroded to a mottled brown. The sign above them read, in the same pastel font as everything else, Grand Assembly Hall, where every plush finds its child. I pushed the left door. It resisted, then gave with a sound like tearing paper. Cold air pushed back against my face, colder than the atrium, significantly, and with that mineral quality intensified. And something else beneath it that I initially could not name, then recognized as the smell of preserved materials, resin, wax, the chemical signature of deliberate conservation. My flashlight barely touched the ceiling. I had known from the architectural schematics that the hall was large. Standing at the threshold with my flashlight producing a cone of light that dissolved into nothing. Before it reached the far wall or ceiling, I understood it in my body rather than my mind, in the specific way that scale registers when you are inside it instead of measuring it from outside. Conveyor belts ran across the floor in parallel tracks, 6 of them that I could see, each wide enough to walk along. Hooks descended from the ceiling rails, or what I assumed were ceiling rails. Somewhere in the dark above, at the intervals of perhaps 8 feet, each hook large enough to accommodate a hanging mass the size of a person. Between them on those hooks and on subdairy racks along the walls hung the plush forms. They were everywhere, hundreds of them, possibly thousands, unfinished bodies in various stages of completion. some merely a shape mass of fabric stuffed to approximate the torso. Others more fully realized, limbs attached, heads in place, only the final details absent. They hung motionless in the still air. They swayed very slightly as the displaced air from the opening door reached them. I want to be precise about this. It was the air movement that caused the swaying. I'm certain of this, but the timing, the way the motion reached them sequentially in the order that corresponds to the air current's progression through the space, produced an impression of sequential response, of noticing, of heads turning one by one towards the door, towards us. Pediophobia, Mina said quietly, as though naming it would reduce its power. The uncanny valley applied to dolls and humanoid figures, completely rational response to hell. There are so many of them. Focus on the machinery, I said. The conveyor system, the assembly architecture. That's why we're here. Sophie had stopped in the doorway. I don't want to go in there, she said. You can stay in the corridor, I told her. I don't want to be alone in the corridor either. She came in. She stayed close to Mina. Then the light came on. Not all the lights, just one. A fluorescent tube somewhere in the middle of the ceiling, blinking to life with a particular reluctant stutter of a tube that has not been asked to function in a very long time. It buzzed. It stabilized. It produced a cone of yellow-white light in the dark above us. There is no power, Caleb said. He said it the way a person says something that they need to be true. Another fluorescent came on, further along, then another. They advanced across the ceiling in a sequence that, had I been in a different building under different circumstances, I might have subscribed it as elegant. A rhythm to it, each light finding its neighbors and ceding to them, the illumination spreading until the conveyor belts were lit, the racks of hanging forms were lit, and the full scope of the hall was visible. The conveyors began to move, not fast. A gentle grinding resumption, the belt surface slipping slightly before catching. The whole mechanism running with the effortful quality of something that had not been used in decades, but has not in some essential way forgotten how. The hooks above began sliding along their rails. The sound they made was dry and rhythmic, and exactly like nothing I had ever heard before, and exactly like something I had heard in some very old nightmare I couldn't quite locate. Kill it, Darius said. He was not joking. I'm trying, Mina said at the panel. And then the footsteps. I want to choose my language carefully here, because language is the only tool I have, and I want to use it precisely. What I heard was not what a human footstep sounds like. Human footsteps have a characteristic acoustic signature determined by mass, gait, and surface material. And what I heard shares some qualities with that signature, the rhythmic pattern, the weight implication, while diverging from it in ways that activated every instinctive alarm my nervous system possesses. It was too heavy. It was too deliberate. The interval between each step was slightly longer than it should be, as though whatever was producing it was taking more care than speed. It came from the far end of the hall, from the darkness that the light had not reached, and then the darkness at the far end of the hall shifted. I knew from the report that Master Patchford was large, The federal investigators had noted his height at approximately 20 feet in standing configuration. I had tried holding this number concretely in my mind during my months of research. I'd looked up comparable structures, the height of a 2-story building, the length of a standard shipping container orientated vertically, and tried to imagine something occupying that space. I'd failed to imagine correctly. What crossed from the darkness into the edge of the fluorescent light was not a monster in the sense that horror gives us monsters. It was not designed for fear, not primarily, not in its origin. It had been designed to enchant. Patchwork fur in colors that might once have been warm and welcoming. Blues, golds, and soft reds stitched together in sections, each section different texture, the whole of it built to suggest comfort, familiarity, writ very large. A teddy bear. It had always been a teddy bear, and whatever alteration 60 years of operation and maintenance had produced, the fundamental design intention persists. The rounded ears, the broad muzzle, the proportions of a creature designed to be held. But it was enormous, and it had not been held. It had been doing something else, in this building, in the dark, for 60 years, and whatever that was had changed it in ways I couldn't see and ways I suspected I could not. One eye was glass, dark amber. It caught the fluorescent light and held it, generating a glow that was not quite a glow, but that my eyes reported as one. The other eye was a button, enormous, black, matte, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it, so that one half of the face was luminous and the other was void. Its head was turned towards us, which means it had known we were here before we could see it. Inspection, it said. The voice was not what I expected. I had expected mechanical distortion, the grindy, squealy audio of a system too long unmaintained. What I heard instead was low and resonant and modulated with a precision that implied very sophisticated audio engineering. And it had quality of patience in it that was somehow worse than any amount of distortion would have been. It was a voice that had been waiting. Inspection overdue. "We need to leave," Sophie said. She was not whispering. She said it in a clear, steady voice, looking directly at the figure, because Sophie, whatever else she is braver than she looks. We ran. The conveyor belts were moving faster now. I felt the vibration of them through the floor, a persistent tremor. And the hooks were swinging above us as the rails accelerated. Darius grabbed my arm as I slipped on a piece of fallen ceiling panel and pulled me forward. And behind us the footsteps were not running, but they were not slowing, each one landing with deliberate certainty that communicated the same thing the voice had communicated: patience. Absolute mechanical patience. Something small scattered across my boot. I looked down for less than a second. It was enough to see the configuration. Mechanical spider-shaped, sewing needles where legs should be, trailing a thin filament of thread. And then it was gone, beneath the nearest conveyor belt. And I chose not to think about where it had gone or how many others might be in the hall with us. A voice came from behind us, not raised, not urgent. "Elena, Mother is waiting." The double doors ahead, I could see them. The warped metal, the broken handle, the gap of the corridor beyond. We were going to reach them. We had enough of a lead. Then Darius went down. His foot caught on a conveyor belt that had shifted from its track. A section near the doors where the mechanism was older. less maintained. The belt surface risen and buckled, and he hit the floor and slid, momentum carrying him towards the assembly rollers at the belt's end. The grinding mechanism that was still turning, slowly, patiently. I grabbed his jacket. Mina grabbed his jacket. We braced against the frame of the belt's housing and pulled. And the mechanism strained against us. And the sound it made was terrible, and for approximately 4 seconds I was not thinking about the figure behind us at all, because the only thing in the world was whether we were going to be able to hold it. We held. Mina saw the hydraulic panel before any of us did, because she had been cataloguing the mechanical system since we entered, and she had stored the information, and she assessed it now with a speed that I'm still grateful for. She hit it with a heel of her palm, not a specific control. There was no time for specific, just a main emergency override. The press arm dropped from somewhere in the ceiling. I heard it before I saw it. A massive hydraulic release, a rushing descent, and then the impact, which was not loud so much as total. The kind of sound that you feel in your chest and your teeth simultaneously. Patchford stopped. Not because the press arm had stopped him. The arm had caught his left shoulder, the connection point between the upper limb and torso, and the damage was visible in the way his arm hung wrong, the angle at which it had been displaced, the stuffing extruding from the torn seam in a slow, continuous exhalation. But he had not fallen. He was still standing. He was just looking at us. Just for a moment, the button eye caught a flicker of light. "Refinement," he said, "required." We went through the doors. The maintenance stairwell was narrow and smelled of rust and the particular dampness of concrete that has been absorbing moisture for decades without recourse. We sat on the steps and we breathed, and nobody spoke for a long time. I counted us. 4. Sophie was shaking. Darius had a dark smear on his right forearm that he was examining with a careful, dissociated attention of someone who is not yet ready to classify what they are looking at as an injury. Mina was already looking back the way we had came, already processing. Caleb was looking at me. "Residual power?" he said. Not a statement. A question, shaped like one. "There's a geothermal reactor beneath the aquarium sector," I said. "The report mentioned it, an off-grid power source that was never disclosed to municipal authorities. You knew there might be active systems?" I suspected. He looked at the door, at the dent in the lower third of it. Not a breach, not nearly, but present where it had not been present before. A shallow impression that had not come from our side, from something outside, testing the surface, testing and finding it sufficient. "It knew your name," Caleb said. "I know. I did not tell them the other part. That it hadn't been Patchford who said my name. It was the public address system that had cracked to life as the red emergency lights bloomed around us, bathing the stairwell in the color of something that had not quite decided between urgency and threat. The lullaby began first. It was quiet, barely audible though, through the stairwell's acoustics, and it was damaged. The audio degraded across 60 years of storage. The melody rapping at its edges. A nursery rhyme, probably. Something my grandmother might have recognized. I did not recognize it, but I felt it. In the specific place, between the sternum and the throat where emotional responses register before they become legible. I felt it there. Then the voice. not through a speaker in the stairwell, not localized, everywhere, the way my grandmother described it. The quality of sound that fills a space completely rather than originating from a point within it. The voice was warm, that was patient and warm, and it had the specific quality of attention my grandmother had described to me once at midnight when I was 9 years old. The quality of attention that is internal, completely, devastatingly yours. "Welcome home, Elena." That was all it said. 2 words after the name. And then the lights went out and only the red remained. And against the door, the impression held steady. And the lullaby continued for exactly long enough to establish something I could not name at the time, and can now name, which is longing. I'm recording this for you from the other side of what happened. I want to be clear about that. I want you to understand that I know how the story ends, at least in terms of whatever I survive to tell it, because I'm here and I'm telling it. What I do not know, what I will never entirely know, is what it cost. What we left inside that building. What I felt inside it. My grandmother used to end her stories before the ending. She would get to a point and stop, and I would wait, and after a while I would understand that the waiting was the answer, that the end was the silence that followed, that she was telling me but not telling me, that some things do not resolve cleanly. What I know is that the lullaby did not stop when we reached the bottom of the stairs. What I know is that the button eye of Master Patchford glowed amber through the crack of the stairwell door long after we had descended past the point where light should have reached. What I know is that my grandmother was 9 years old in the summer of 1965, and she was the one who got out, and that she spent the rest of her life telling me what she remembered from the inside. What I know is that by the time Mother said my name, it already sounded like a welcome home. If tonight's story stayed with you, become part of the Pink Collective by liking, commenting, and subscribing. Until next time, Pink Collective, stay curious, stay safe, and stay pink. And remember, you only need to find yourself. The rest can be Googled.